started. Thank you and welcome to the weekly seminar series of the National Center, etc. Yeah, but for the NCTSPM, the National Center for Transportation Systems, Productivity and Management. All right, so our speaker today is Ken Laberteaux. He's a senior principal scientist with the Future Mobility Research Department at Toyota Research Institute of North America. So he comes to us from Detroit or Ann Arbor, Michigan, where they are based, and doing lots of interesting research on the future of mobility in the R&D enterprise of Toyota. So he's been at this for a while. He's actually a PhD in electrical engineering. So he started his career doing a lot of advanced electrical and connected wireless systems to connect vehicles and make them smarter and so on. And then has transitioned somewhat into studying more about the future of human mobility, travel behavior, land use, location choices, and how all of this might be impacted by what we're seeing with advanced mobility options, such as autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, and so on. And so to tell us all about it, here is Ken Laberteaux.
Thank you very much, Ron. And thank you very much for the invitation. My first time to Atlanta. Actually, you can't say that. I've driven to Atlanta a few times on my way to Florida. That was back in college. So my talk is called Tracking Transportation Trends, Generalized Suburbs and Automated Driving. So let's get started. So you're going to hear a lot of predictions or things that are going to sound like predictions, and I just want you to know that I take all of this with a grain of salt, and I hope you do too. Predictions are very hard to do, and so if I predict something that you don't like the sounds of, the good news is I'm probably wrong. Okay, here are some other predictions that have been made in this space. By show of hands, if you've heard this recently, era of abundant fuel has ended for good. Okay. The romance with the car is ending. Absolutely. Public transportation about to do a big revival. This notion of one occupant per car is just wasteful, can't happen, silly. Finally, that there's going to be this great re-urbanization by the middle class. They're going to give up their cars, become healthy and connected with their neighborhoods and walk to stores and stuff. If you've heard these before, it might be from the 1973 Time magazine cover story, where every single one of those predictions were made. And as you probably remember, or at least have read about, those who weren't born in '73, this was a time when for international political reasons, there was a embargo by OPEC. Basically, they said we're not going to sell gas, as much gas to the U.S. because we don't like their stance on Middle East politics. And gas prices went through the roof, long lines of gas, lots of discussion about how we were going to end our addiction to oil. There were solar panels put on the White House, lots of happy talk about how we're just way too exposed to the oil industry and that has to stop. Shortly thereafter, OPEC changed course, the price of gas collapsed, the solar panels came off the White House, and a lot of good intentions kind of went away. And so I think it's very fair to ask, what's really different now? What have we learned? How can we prevent that from happening this time around? So let's look at mobility demand. And there's a very long history in the United States where new transportation technologies have come in, made it faster or more comfortable to commute. And as a result, we've seen the U.S. sprawl. And there's this really great book by Kenneth Jackson. There's a cover in the upper hand corner called Crabgrass Frontier. He talks about the first ferry connecting the southern tip of Manhattan to what was then Brooklyn. And before that happened, Brooklyn was, basically rural. And then the steam ferries came, and people could cross that pretty cheaply and pretty quickly. And within 30 years, Brooklyn was completely inhabited, completely developed. And the developers, I should probably put it in my slides, this great pamphlet trying to encourage people to come move to Brooklyn. And it was exactly the same arguments that are made for suburban development today. You can have a quiet place away from the hubbub, with crime, great place to raise a family, plus you get all the amenities of being able to get to downtown within 30 minutes. And like I said, this is taken place time and time again. I think it's fair to say that we are a predominantly car-oriented country. What we're looking at here is a histogram. So from your left to right, this is the census tract at a certain population, and it's logarithmic. And you can see, the big peak is in this, 2 to 10,000 people per square mile, which is quite a bit lower than what most of us would consider urban density. And that car ownership is really high across the board, and even in the very densest parts of the country, you're seeing about 7 out of 10 households with a car. So from the NPTS, and then it was renamed the NHTS from 90, 95, 2001, and 2009, the percentage of U.S. person travel miles by private vehicle was around 90%, and the percent of U.S. person trips by private vehicle also in the 80s. Okay, so we have this history of car ownership and car usage. Let's look at how that has impacted where we live. So this is a great figure from the 2000 census that basically showed us where we lived then. You can see the big spikes. This is where we are right here. But you can see the Eastern Seaboard, Chicago, and just in general, a lot denser population here as compared to out here, except for the West Coast. And if you were to take kind of the center point of where the population median is, up here, this is what it would look like. So kind of this inexorable march to the south. We did some deep dives looking at the population changes or expected population changes. We hear a lot about urbanization, and there are some very real trends that we'll talk about. But we need to consider that in the macroscopic sense. What this slide is showing us is where the regional council of governments, kind of the regional coalition of governments that are doing infrastructure planning and road planning, and where are they going to lay sewer pipes and highway miles and all that. This is where they're predicting the new growth in Atlanta. You can see that it pretty much follows along this highway. They don't completely have a ring road in Denver, but a lot of growth is kind of expected to be there. And this photo right here actually is a picture taken with the camera here about 25, 30 miles outside of downtown. You can see all this new development, new schools and shopping, and then this is their highway to get back into downtown. This is the expected expected location of new jobs in Denver. And again, you see them kind of tightly correlated with highways, and especially at the intersection of highways. So to flatten this job data, this is basically taking the area and breaking it into circles. So we have this fraction of total jobs within 35 miles of downtown Denver. So about 25% of the jobs in 2000, with, and that's decreasing in the inner circle. The kind of mid-range circle is the largest right now, but decreasing, and then this outer circle, this 10 to 35 mile range, is where most of the growth is expecting. And you see a very similar trend here in Atlanta, except it's just a little bit further along. And this is important because I think a lot of people, when they start looking for where they're going to live, I mean, just what I think people do is they kind of drop a couple of pins on a map of where they know they need to go frequently, and then they draw kind of a circle-ish thing around there, and say, you know, basically we'll look anywhere inside this shape, and then we'll optimize. You know, if school's really important, we'll go there. If we want a bigger house, or a country house, or an urban house, and you just optimize. But it used to be, when we were more of a manufacturing economy, the city centers were often where that manufacturing took place, and a lot of jobs were there. And so a lot of people had to live within range of their jobs. With the jobs kind of leaving the cities, that is kind of creating this spiral of suburbanization. So the commuting patterns are also pretty strong. What we see is that the people who start and end their commute in the city has remained pretty constant over the last 5 or 6 decades. What has really gotten large is people who live in one suburb and commute to another suburb. So here are the details of the 3 cities that we took a look at. You know, in general, roughly the fraction of growth in the entire metro area as compared to the growth inside the city limits. You know, commuting by transit is pretty small, even in Atlanta, even in Chicago, which is actually has a pretty high fraction of jobs in the CBD. You can see that down here. I know there's a lot of numbers here, and we're not going to be able to see them all, but we see fairly typical values for, you know, Atlanta being this extremely fast-growing city, just Denver, which we believe is kind of a kind of middle of the range growing city, and then Chicago, which is kind of more of a city that is large and is growing only very slowly. Do you have a quick question?
Yes. What year is that from?
So it's mostly 2010.
Okay.
So you can see, you know, metro growth. Population is 2010.
Yeah.
And I can make these slides available if that's of interest. Again, what we see is that this is looking at the fraction of residential locations, looking at the 98 largest MSAs in the country, and looking at what fraction is inside the city limits. First thing, and it's 1990 is the far left, the gray bar is 2000, 2010. And what I see here is, first, everything is above 60%. So we're already have many more people living outside of cities than inside of cities. But it's also growing, and it's growing pretty monotonically in all parts of the country. Okay. Are you depressed yet? I should just say that as a personal aside, Ram mentioned that I did a change of topics and got into this area. Very excited about all the new trends that were happening and how that relate to sustainability. I was really surprised when I saw these numbers. I don't know if you're surprised, but I was really surprised. There is some good news, of course. There are definitely changes, big changes going on in the technology being put into personal vehicles. And the batteries, especially the battery technology, has improved so much in the past few decades. But again, let's take it with the right understanding. What I'm showing here is a picture of the Chevy Volt battery, 435-pound device that costs several $1,000s. I don't know exactly, but if you assume that it's at least $250 per kilowatt hour, several $1,000s. And you take it home and you either charge at level 1, which takes a half day, or you can buy a $1,000 charger and that'll shrink it down to 3 or 4 hours. And after you've done all of that, you put the same amount of range into that car as a gallon is. And so from a mile-to-mile perspective, we're looking at energy storage which is approximately 75 times heavier and 1,000 times more expensive. And this is why I think you still see a lot of, I know in Atlanta, or in Georgia in general, there's been large subsidies put on battery electric vehicles, and I'm really encouraged to see how many Leafs I drove by. Wish there were a few more Priuses, but still a lot. I mean, it's very impressive to see how many of these advanced technology cars are out there, and the kind of commitment that you as a society, as a government, are making to that. But it's still really hard, and trying to put all of the miles into a battery, as you can see, this is just a 40-mile car too. It's still really hard. It's just really, from almost every perspective except for the environment, gasoline is actually a pretty good technology. I mean, it's light, dense, easily portable, well, especially easily portable now that we've built an entire gasoline infrastructure. But, I mean, we're not starting with a clean sheet. Gasoline has a big head start, and this is in part why I think we've all seen somewhat disappointing sales nationally of some of these plug-in cars. Okay, so I am going to float an idea here. This is something that we've published in a conference paper, and we're trying to spruce it up for journal publication, but let's consider why. I mean, so what I'm pointing to is that cost is a big hurdle to take on the kind of gasoline-powered transportation system that we have. And I'm going to talk about XEVs, or XEVs, which that means hybrids, plug-in hybrids, battery electric vehicles, fuel cell electric vehicles, compared to a conventional vehicle. And even if you factor in the 3-year operating costs, what you see is, even once it's subsidized, the average plug-in car compared to the average conventional vehicle car is still high. Okay, less so here in Georgia because of the nice $5,000 credit, but it's still, for the most part, we're not seeing price parity. So how do we address that? So the question, I'll ask a couple questions. Can we, without increasing the total incentive dollars, and with the goal of increasing XEV sales, can we concentrate incentives on key customers such that XEVs are priced competitively with CVs? And secondly, can we simultaneously increase the CO2 mitigated per incentive dollar? Can we further simultaneously address income equity issues of those incentives. I don't know if people understand what I mean by that. This is a very big issue in California. The idea being that there are these large tax credits being given to mostly upper income people, as opposed to middle and lower class, and people being concerned that that's so lopsided. Can we further simultaneously create a strong disincentive for suburban sprawl? And the answer is, in theory, yes. In practice, a lot of work is needed. But let me just please indulge me. I'll give you at least one idea that I'm hoping you'll catch on. The intuition here is if you look at the XM version of a car compared to its exact make and model of the conventional vehicle, you'll see a very large difference in the fuel economy, especially for stop and go driving, and a much smaller difference in highway driving. And the intuitive understanding of this is that all the XEVs have some form of battery that, through regenerative braking and just the fact that stopping and starting a car from 0 miles per hour takes a lot of energy, and the round trip energy efficiency through a battery and then out through a motor is much, much higher than your typical gas car. So what I'm saying is just about any car that has this property of being able to collect some energy locally in a battery and play it out through a motor is going to do really well in stop and start driving. But if you take that same car and put it on a highway, it might still get pretty good gas mileage, but you're still carrying around a fairly heavy battery. And at cruising speeds, fuel efficiencies are much more dictated by rolling resistance, air resistance, things like that. You can make a very efficient running engine to run on a highway. So the point being is, in some sense, the best car for city driving is a lousy choice for highway driving. And the best car for highway driving is somewhat of a lousy choice for city driving. So what we did is we went out and we looked at the EPA gas mileage in 2004, and we took the 14 different vehicles for which there's an exact make and model for both a gas and a XEV. So you won't see Prius up here because we don't make a gas-only Prius, but you do see Camry up here because we have a hybrid Camry as well as a gas Camry. And we just looked at the savings of GHG per 100 miles for making that switch. So the idea is, can we motivate a certain customer to make that incremental investment for the XL? And we look at what it's like to do that for someone who doesn't, drives the city cycle versus the highway cycle. And the results were pretty drastic. What we found was that it's between 2.5 to 4 times. So 200 to 400% more CO2 saved for this driver versus that driver. What I'm saying is, if I can convince a Mr. City, if I have a Mr. City and a Mr. Highway both considering a Camry or a Camry hybrid, and I have some money to try and incentivize one or both of them, if I give enough money to Mr. City, that he'll make that change, that upgrade, versus if I did that for the Mr. Highway, I'm going to get a 3 to 4 times more CO2 reduction for that dollar than I did for someone who predominantly draws a highway drive. And then, so that's the general idea. We've done some more recent work. So what does this mean? What I think this means is that currently our policies, we will give someone so much money based solely on what car they're driving, some spec of the car, right? But absolutely no consideration of how they'll likely use the car. Right? what this is saying is, if we could identify a group of people that, or a fleet of cars that were mostly going to do city-type driving, it really makes sense to concentrate the incentives and shift them over to the people who are going to maximize the CO2 mitigation per dollar. Right? Now, if you were really clever and had already read our papers, you would know, not that you'd be really clever for having read our papers, but if you were really clever or if you had gotten the answer from our paper, the first question you should be asking is, yeah, about how many people are actually Mr. City and Mr. Highway? Because people who live in the cities drive out to their friends on highways, people from the highway do a lot of stuff driving. What people aren't EPA drive cycles people. And so since the time that this has been published, we've done some unpublished work which shows that there are, in fact, people who are more city and more highway. The difference isn't quite as stark here, but I think roughly what we're seeing is take one group of city-esque drivers and one group of highway-esque drivers, comprising kind of the 15% of VMT on both ends of that spectrum. The city people are getting about 2 times the CO2 mitigation. So that's work in progress. Okay, so I'm going to shift a little bit to automation. I actually met Professor Ram at this conference called the ABS 14 Automated Vehicle Symposium, and they did this poll of the attendees, and I would say that that's as good of a poll of kind of conventional wisdom of experts as I've seen. And what that kind of indicated is that automation levels 2 and 3, which are what I mean by that is a car that can be partially automated for certain kinds of driving, but there always needs to be a capable driver sitting in the driver's seat, ready to take over whenever the car says, I can't do this anymore. That's going to come earlier than full automation, and that it's going to be probably easiest in certain conditions like highway driving before anything else. And this isn't just an assumption now, because now we actually have cars that can do limited amount of hands-free highway driving in the marketplace, or at least in the downstream marketplace. So what the point the thing that strikes me about that is, if we're going to have a transition period where partial automation is kind of the default and full automation comes much later, I would argue that until you at least get to what I call level 4 empty, by level 4 empty what I mean is, I believe that we will probably as a society allow cars to drive with no one in them before we put our children and our elderly and so forth. Until we get to this point, it's really hard for me to understand what the impact to the ownership or business model is. Meaning that my intuition is for the next 10, 15 years, you'll be able to buy an upgrade, $1,000 to $5,000 upgrade on your car, which will, as time goes on, be able to drive an increasing fraction of your daily trips. It still may be the case that in every single trip, getting out of your driveway still is going to require a manual operation, but a larger fraction. But the reality is, even if that's the case, you still need a driver. You still need someone who's responsible for being behind the wheel. The whole notion of autonomous taxis, which I think is very exciting, and how that could relate to car sharing. We can do that, but that's only going to be allowed once we're convinced that those cars can move around by themselves without any person able to take over. And I argue that that is a ways off. And as a result, I generally think that those levels of automation are probably going to increase driving demand before they increase some of these new city-type urban models like automated taxis and car sharing. Because, like I said in one of the earlier slides, if I can make your trip more comfortable, or you can do more and value your time more while you're on the highway, you know, there's really no precedence where that doesn't lead to longer commutes. Okay. This section on Gen Y is, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and so this is all kind of, I wouldn't even really call this part research. This is kind of what I think is, this is kind of my opinions based on what I see on the data, but I hope we have a good chance to talk about it here after the next few slides. First thing to say is that we know that Gen Y, and for anyone who's not sure, Gen Y is roughly 18 to 30 years old as of today. We know that Gen Y is driving a whole lot less than other people at this age, and that it's not by a small amount, it's by a large amount. Some of that has to be mitigated by the fact that the last two data points were in 2001, which was a peak year in our economy, at least up until 9/11. And then the next data point we have is in 2009, which is a almost cataclysmic recession. So we know that when the economy goes way down, driving goes way down. So some of this is certainly due to recession. And it's probably also very rational for people to look at the last couple dots and kind of assume that that line is going to continue. So whatever you think about what's going to happen next, there is no doubt that this generation as a whole are driving less, getting licenses less, and so forth. What I would say, though, is that a lot of that has to do with the fact that for a whole variety of reasons, actually I'm going to jump ahead and come back to this slide. For a whole bunch of reasons, we're seeing Gen Y starting marriages, having their first marriage or having their first child later and later in life. Okay? And we are literally seeing a kind of new marketplace, a new consumer of kind of the post-college. People have some money but don't have a spouse or don't have a family, and are, you know, kind of this new childless decade of behavior that I think is very different than what we see from people who do have families. But yet we still have a lot of reason to believe that Gen Y wants to have a family. When you ask them, do you want to get married, do you want to have children, they always say at very high levels, yes. And we also, at least historically, have seen that while there is certainly a larger fraction than 30 years ago, people saying, I don't want to have it, I don't ever want to have children. The reality is that the difference between young people today, so what this chart is saying is that in 2010, 70% of women between 20 and 24 had never had a child. And in that same year, the group of women 20 years older, only 15% had never had a child. Meaning that as, you know, the fraction of women who have never had a child is actually somewhat small, if you consider 50%. So that's what we're seeing. I mean, the earlier slides that I showed of just Atlanta and Denver kind of showed that the majority of the growth was kind of at the periphery. But if you look at this a little bit more, what you see is in the very biggest cities, which is what this line is. And what this is the fraction of growth for various areas distance from the center of the city. So the first is, the fraction of growth of population in the first 2 miles, the 2 to 4 mile donut, the 5 to 9 mile donut, the 10 to 14, and so forth. So overall, you definitely are seeing this growth between 20 and 2010 on the periphery. But in the biggest cities, you're seeing almost as much growth in the core of the city as you are at the edges. And again, I think this makes a lot of sense when you consider the large growth of people in their 20s that don't have children. A lot of them like city living. A lot of people at this point in their life, at least me at that point in my life, were very happy to live in with very little privacy, sharing rooms, sharing kitchens, sharing bathrooms, in order to be close to things that were fun and people that were fun. And I think you're seeing that. I think that trend is going to continue to grow. There is this new dynamic of urban renewal, but it's mostly, I would say, in the cores of the biggest cities. And what, the real $100 zillion question is, when Gen Y starts having children at a larger fraction, will the 10 years that they've spent enjoying the city lead them to be much more likely to try and stay there once their family starts? Or will they be kind of seeing the same economic carrots and sticks of where the good schools are, where the low crime is, where you can get a backyard, where you can get an unfinished basement for your kids to tear up? I have one of those 2 kids that like to tear it up. I think this is the $100 million question, and I don't think any of us knows the answer to this question, and I'd be very hesitant to believe anyone who says they know what people are going to do in the future. So, I'll just finish with this, this great 20th century American philosopher, Yogi Berra, saying, "It ain't over till it's over." And what I mean by that is, I think there's a lot of sobering, kind of frustrating stuff in these slides. But it really is our collective decision. It really is our collective decision how much we tax gas. It really is our decision how we decide to fund public schools in our country. It really is a choice of these really important factors that influence where we live and how we transport each other. And, in the end, it's kind of our collective decision. If we want to make a change, we have to make a change. That is my last slide, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You said about the weight of the battery. What about the weight of the engine itself? For example, weight of the gasoline engine versus 2 drivetrain engines for the PHEV and for just the battery electric vehicle engine.
I haven't done that calculation straight up. My intuition is that on a horsepower equivalent basis, the weight of a motor and the weight of an engine are, within an order of magnitude of each other. But I don't know the answer to that question. I do think that the weight of the battery is significant. I do think that cars that have really big batteries tend to have lower miles per gallon at highway driving, mostly because of that weight. Yes, sir.
How have sales at Toyota compared now that we're well into recovery versus before the recession?
how are sales?
I mean, how have they compared? I mean, has the trend you're talking about affected your sales negatively, or is it still about the same?
Well, I mean,
if you know.
the entire car industry went through a major convulsion, 4 or 5 years ago. GM essentially went through bankruptcy, and all of us had it as bad. It's just that GM had some legacy costs and less cash on hand, but we all burned a lot of cash during that time. Now sales are pretty good. Sales are pretty good. It's a good time to be in the car industry. Yes, sir.
One thing I'm curious about your thoughts on is throughout the presentation I kept hearing this narrative that, with technological advances there's greater mobility and thus greater spatial dispersion of cities.